I never expected to be filing a police report against my own family, not against strangers, not against some faceless corporation, against the man who had stood 6 feet away from me at my husband's graveside, holding my hand, telling me everything was going to be okay. The man who had called himself my brother for 6 years. But I am getting ahead of myself. My husband and I met at a coffee shop in Austin when I was 24 and he was 26. I had spilled an entire oat milk latte on his laptop, and instead of getting angry, he had looked up at me with those brown eyes and said, "Well, now I have an excuse to buy the new model." We were engaged 14 months later, married at 26 and 28 respectively, in a small ceremony in the Texas Hill Country with wildflowers on every table and his brother standing beside him as best man. My husband was the kind of person who remembered your coffee order after meeting you once, would quietly pay a stranger's bill at a restaurant and then pretend he hadn't, who built his company from a single desk in our spare bedroom into something worth being proud of. A digital marketing agency with 11 employees and a client list that had taken 7 years of 60-hour weeks to build. He named it after the street where we had our first apartment. He never told anyone that part. I only knew because I had watched him type the name in for the first time at 2 in the morning, laughing softly to himself. His brother was 4 years older and had been there from the beginning. Not for the 60-hour weeks, for the celebratory dinners when a big client signed, for the holidays and the birthday parties and the moments that looked good in photos. My husband had loved him anyway, the way you love someone who has been in your life so long that loving them is simply a habit you can no longer imagine breaking. My husband died on a Tuesday in March. A truck ran a red light on his way back from a client meeting. He was 33 years old. The paramedic said it was immediate. I have spent a considerable amount of time deciding whether that is supposed to be comforting. The weeks after the funeral are not something I can describe in full. Grief at that level is not linear, it is not a process. It is more like weather. Some days you can function, go to the grocery store, answer emails, and then something as small as finding his chapstick in your coat pocket will put you on the floor of the hallway for an hour. I functioned. I answered emails. I found his chapstick 3 weeks after the funeral and I sat on the floor of the hallway for a long time. My mother-in-law came by often. She brought food and sat with me and cried with me, and I was genuinely grateful for her presence. My father-in-law was quieter, more formal. The kind of man who expresses love through practicality. He fixed the gutter that had been draining wrong all winter and didn't mention it. My brother-in-law called every few days. He asked how I was doing. He told me the company was in good hands, that he had been going into the office to check on things, that I didn't need to worry. I should tell you something about the company. When my husband first started it, his brother had invested $30,000 and borrowed from their parents largely in exchange for a 20% stake. That arrangement had been formalized in the original partnership documents. Over the years, as the company grew, my husband had bought his brother out gradually. By the time my husband died, my brother-in-law owned 8%. My husband owned the rest, and that ownership transferred to me. My brother-in-law knew this. He had signed the updated paperwork himself. 4 months after my husband's funeral, his parents hosted a family dinner. It was a Sunday in July, the kind of thick Texas evening where the air sits on you like a warm blanket. My mother-in-law made brisket and cornbread, the same thing she had been making for family dinners since before I joined the family. And the table was set with the good dishes that only came out for occasions. I helped her carry food to the table. My father-in-law poured sweet tea. My brother-in-law arrived 20 minutes late with a bottle of wine and an expression I did not know how to read. We ate. We talked about small things. My mother-in-law asked if I'd been sleeping. My father-in-law mentioned a trip they were considering taking. My brother-in-law was quieter than usual, and I noticed it, the way you notice a change in air pressure before a storm, but I said nothing. Dessert was peach cobbler. My mother-in-law was cutting it when my brother-in-law set down his fork and cleared his throat. He said he had something he needed to share with the family, something that had been weighing on him for a while. He said he had struggled with whether to bring it up, but that ultimately he felt my husband would have wanted everything to be handled properly. I set down my own fork. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He had kept his jacket on through the entire meal, which I now understood, and produced a folded document. He smoothed it on the table and slid it toward me. He said that in the months before my husband died, the two of them had had several conversations about the future of the company. He said my husband had expressed concern about what would happen to the business if something happened to him, had worried that with respect, he said, looking at me carefully, had no background in running an agency, and had agreed verbally and then in writing to transfer full ownership of the company to his brother in the event of his death. In exchange, his brother would pay me a lump sum of $150,000 as a buyout of my interest. He tapped the document on the table. The company, he said, had recently been valued at just over $900,000. My in-laws were both very still. My mother-in-law's hand was resting on the cobbler dish. No one was eating. I looked at the document. It was typed on what appeared to be company letterhead. It bore what appeared to be my husband's signature at the bottom, dated 8 months ago, about 4 months before he died. There was a notary stamp. I looked at it for a long time. My brother-in-law said he knew this was a lot to process. He said he hoped I understood that he had genuinely cared about my husband and that this was not about money so much as honoring what my husband had wanted for the business he had built. He said he thought $150,000 was a fair and generous offer and that he had already spoken to a lawyer about drafting the transfer paperwork. I looked up from the document. I said, "Thank you for showing me this." My mother-in-law made a small sound. My brother-in-law looked slightly surprised. I think he had expected tears or anger or both. My father-in-law was looking at his hands. I said I would need to take a copy of the document to review with my own attorney, if he didn't mind. I kept my voice completely level. I asked if there was more cobbler. There was a pause. Then my mother-in-law stood and went to get more cobbler, and the conversation moved to other things, and my brother-in-law spent the rest of the evening watching me with an expression that was half satisfaction and half something that might have been unease. I drove home alone. I sat in my car in the driveway for about 10 minutes. Then I went inside, poured a glass of water, and called my attorney. I should tell you now what my brother-in-law did not know. 11 months before my husband died, he came home from a lunch meeting with his brother and sat down at our kitchen island and told me something. He told me that his brother had been pressuring him, that was the word he used, pressuring, to restructure the ownership of the company, to formalize a larger role for him in exchange for vague promises about future involvement, future investment. My husband had been uncomfortable. He felt something shift in the lunch, he said. Something he could not name exactly but could not shake. My husband was not a paranoid person. He was, if anything, too generous in his assumptions about people, so when he said something felt wrong, I took it seriously. We talked about it for a long time that night, and over the weeks that followed, because the conversations with his brother continued, my husband did something I did not ask him to do but will be grateful for the rest of my life. He started keeping a record. Every conversation with his brother that touched on the company, in person, over the phone, by text, my husband documented. He kept a running note on his personal laptop, time-stamped, detailed. He never told his brother he was doing it. He also, about 6 months before he died, called our estate attorney and asked to have a letter drafted, to be sealed and held by the firm, to be opened only if something happened to him. He told me about the letter. He said he hoped I would never need it, and he smiled when he said it, the way he smiled when he wanted to make something lighter than it was. 2 weeks after his funeral, before I could think clearly about much of anything, I had called our estate attorney to begin the probate process. She had mentioned the sealed letter. I had asked her to hold it until I felt ready. I was not ready for a long time. I also want to tell you about the Saturday 3 weeks before that family dinner, when I had finally sat down with the full record on my husband's laptop and read through every entry. I read for 4 hours. By the end, I was not crying. I was something else entirely, very clear and very calm, the way a room is clear after all the furniture has been moved out. The following Monday, I called my attorney and made an appointment. I brought the laptop and a printed summary I had made myself. We talked for 2 hours. When I left her office, we had a plan, so when my brother-in-law slid that document across the dinner table, I was not unprepared. I was, in fact, the most prepared person in that room. I'd simply been waiting to see whether he would actually do it. He had. My attorney's name is Patricia, and she is exactly the kind of woman you want in your corner when someone has decided to commit felony fraud against you while you are still in the early stages of learning how to sleep without your husband. She does not raise her voice. She does not need to. The morning after the family dinner, I sent her a photo of the document my brother-in-law had shown me. She called me back within the hour. She said, "Look at the notary stamp. Look at the expiration date on the commission." I looked. The notary whose stamp appeared on the document had a commission that, according to public records, had expired the previous January, 2 months before the date printed on the document itself. A notarization performed after a commission expires is invalid. More to the point, it suggested the document had been backdated. Patricia had already pulled the notary's public record. She said there was more. She had also cross-referenced the document's formatting, the header, the font specifications, the margin settings, against templates from the company's current design suite. The template used on the document had only been added to the company's systems in late February. My husband had died in March. If the document was dated the previous August, it should not have existed in that format. We had the document itself, which my brother-in-law had, perhaps overconfidently, given me a copy of at my quiet request at the end of the evening. We had my husband's documented record of every conversation, none of which referenced any agreement remotely resembling what the document described. And then Patricia told me it was time to open the letter. I went to her office that afternoon. She handed me the sealed envelope, my husband's handwriting on the front, just my name. And I sat in the chair across from her desk and opened it. He had written it by hand, 4 pages, in the small, tight cursive he used when he was being careful. I will not share all of it here. Some things belong only to me. But I will tell you the relevant parts. He wrote that he had become genuinely concerned about his brother's intentions toward the company. That his brother had, on 2 separate occasions, asked him to sign documents that my husband had reviewed and declined. One, restructuring ownership, one establishing a new joint account with co-withdrawal rights. He wrote that he had kept records of everything and that they were on his personal laptop in a folder I would know how to find. He wrote the name of the folder. He also wrote that in the most recent conversation, 6 weeks before he died, his brother had made a comment that my husband had recorded on his phone. He wrote the date. He wrote that the recording was saved in his phone backup under a specific file name and that if anything happened to him he wanted me to have it. He wrote that he hoped I would never need any of this. He wrote that he loved me more than the hill country and the wildflowers and the little coffee shop where I had ruined his laptop. He wrote that whatever happened, I was going to be okay. I sat in Patricia's office for a while after I finished reading. Then I said, "Let's talk about next steps." Patricia had already been in contact with a forensic document examiner. The examiner's analysis, completed within the week, confirmed what we had suspected. The document bore signs of digital manipulation. The notary commission discrepancy was definitive evidence of backdating, and the signature, while a skillful imitation, showed several micro-inconsistencies with authenticated samples of my husband's signature from documents signed in the same period. The audio recording my husband had saved was 11 minutes long. My brother-in-law's voice was clear. He said, among other things, that if something ever happened to my husband, he needed to make sure the business stayed in the family where it belonged. He said, and this is the part that Patricia flagged, that he had already started thinking about how to document things properly, just in case. My husband's voice on the recording was steady. He said he didn't think that kind of planning was necessary. His brother said you never know. Patricia filed a complaint with the district attorney's office on a Thursday. The following Tuesday, she called my in-laws. I want to be honest about this part because it is the part I find hardest to think about, even now. My in-laws had not known. I believe that without reservation. My mother-in-law called me the night after Patricia's call and she was barely coherent. And I sat on the phone with her for almost an hour while she cried and apologized and cried again. My father-in-law got on the phone at some point and said very little, but what he said he meant. They had believed their son when he told them there was a document. They had not known he forged it. I told them I knew that. I told them I was not angry at them. I told them the truth. That I was mostly just exhausted and sad, and that I missed my husband with a specific and physical intensity that had not decreased in 4 months and did not show signs of decreasing anytime soon. My mother-in-law said she was sorry for what her son had done. She said my husband had been the best person she knew. Better, she said quietly, than she had probably told him often enough. I told her he had known. My brother-in-law was arrested on a Friday morning at his apartment, charged with forgery, fraud, and attempted theft. He called my father-in-law from the police station. My father-in-law called me. I did not answer. I texted him back an hour later to say that he and my mother-in-law were welcome to call me any time, and that I was sorry this was happening to their family and that I had made the only decision I could make. He texted back one word: understood. The case did not go to trial. Faced with the forensic analysis, the audio recording, the notary documentation, and the time-stamped records my husband had kept for nearly a year, my brother-in-law's attorney negotiated a plea. He was sentenced to 18 months probation, ordered to pay restitution for legal costs, and required to sign documentation formally relinquishing any and all claims to the company or its assets. I kept the company. I kept the 11 employees who had worked for my husband, several of whom had been with him since the early years in the spare bedroom. I hired a managing director with 20 years of agency experience to run day-to-day operations. The company is doing well. I stay involved in the larger decisions and try not to make them from a place of grief, which is harder than it sounds. I still have the 4-page letter. I keep it in the drawer of the nightstand on his side of the bed, which I still think of as his side. I have read it many times. I will probably read it many more. The thing no one tells you about being betrayed by someone you trusted, and I say this as someone who has now been through it in the most concrete possible way, is that the betrayal does not actually touch the love. The love is still there, intact, exactly where you put it. My brother-in-law tried to use my grief as a door he could walk through. He tried to reach into the space my husband had left and take what was there. What he did not understand is that my husband had seen him clearly long before I had and had quietly, methodically, lovingly made sure that I would be protected. I think about that sometimes. About my husband sitting at that kitchen island 11 months before he died. Not angry, just careful. About him staying late at the office to document a conversation. About him calling our attorney on a Tuesday afternoon to have a letter prepared, just in case, because he loved me and he was thorough and he wanted me to be okay. He was the most practical romantic I have ever known. I do not have a relationship with my brother-in-law anymore. I do not expect to. My in-laws and I have found our way back to something careful and tender. They come for dinner occasionally. They are gracious and gentle, and we do not speak about their son except once, when my mother-in-law said she was sorry her family had given me one more thing to grieve. I told her she had also given me my husband. We both left it there. I am 31 years old. I do not know what the next chapter looks like in any specific way, and I have decided that is acceptable for now. What I know is this: I still live in the house we bought together. The spare bedroom, where the company started, has been repainted. The gutter my father-in-law fixed still drains correctly. There are wildflowers in the garden that I planted myself last spring, because I am learning, slowly and imperfectly, that tending something is its own kind of faith. My husband used to say that the best investment you can make is in people who show up. He meant it as business advice. I have come to understand it as something larger. He showed up for me even from that drawer on his side of the bed. He showed up in the most practical and permanent way he knew how. And because he did, I am still here. Still standing. Still, on the good days, laughing, the way he would have wanted me to. That is enough. For now, that is more than enough.